Our next speaker is Robert Ness from Gamelin. All right, I can't hear you yet. You're still on mute.
All right,
perfect.
Okay.
It's working. Zena, at least I can still see your slide. So if maybe you could stop sharing, or maybe that's just me, but perfect. Thank you.
Okay, let me share my screen. One second here. Shoot. Great. The title of my, first off, I'm Robert Osazuwa Ness. Title of my talk is Towards Causal Inference with Latent Variable Models and Programs. And this is joint work with my collaborators, Dr. Olga Vitek and Sarah Thierry at Northeastern University and Jeremy Zucker at PNNL. And I had some connection issues earlier, so I recorded my lecture here. So let me just play it here, and it should be easiest to do it that way.
There are strong connections between probabilistic programming and causality.
Okay. Can I just check with you, John? Is that, can you hear that okay?
Yes, I can hear it fine. Thank you.
Okay.
There are strong connections between probabilistic programming and causality. Standard operating procedure in probabilistic programming is to model abstractions in the data generating process and the relationships between them, causal relationships. Probabilistic programming is descended from directed graphical models, also known as Bayes nets, where causal inference is a common use case. Cognitive scientists use probabilistic programming to model how humans generate explanations. The vision as inverse graphics model of computer vision is a causal model. There are connections to computer simulation where we directly model mechanism. So can we use our probabilistic programming models to make causal inferences? How can we construct our models so that we can apply formal methods from causal inference? Can we use the native abstractions of our models in causal reasoning, or do we have to explicitly model something called a potential outcome? Can we use the generative explanatory nature of our models, or are we limited to doing Bayesian inference on potential outcomes as if it were a missing data problem? Finally, how can we do causal inference from data when many of the variables in our model are not observed in the data? Here, I illustrate how we can do some of these things using a simple example of a causal-directed latent variable model. Suppose we have the following plate model representation of a data generating process. We generate n IID points of the variables u, x, and y. We describe generation of endpoints of data using the following plate model representation. Further, we assume the directed structure of the graph reflects actual causal relationships between u, x, and y in the true data generating process. We further assume the causal Markov condition, meaning that the joint probability distribution between u, x, and y will factorize along the causal graph into the product of conditional distributions on each node. So we get a generative model that samples each of these items in sequence. Let's further assume that the parameters of these conditional distributions are known a priori. Given this model, I want to simulate from the intervention distribution on y. This is the distribution of y given do x equals small x prime, or using the more simplified shorthand, y sub small x prime. Causal-directed graphical models give us a tool for simulating intervention called graph mutilation. In graph mutilation, we remove the incoming edge to x, set its value to the intervention value small x prime, and then we can forward simulate from this transformed model. In the general case of probabilistic programming, we can view this as a kind of program transformation, one that replaces the expression that samples the variable x with one that assigns it a constant value, breaking its dependence on any expression that came before it in the program. We then sample from this transformed model. The pseudocode here shows how we can implement something like this in a probabilistic programming language like Pyro, using something like Pyro's do operator, which will transform the program. Now, suppose we did not know the parameters of the conditional distributions. We can model them as random variables and make them explicit in the DAG, like in a Bayesian hierarchical model. To be clear, these thetas are not causes. They just parameterize the conditional distributions of our original set of variables. We call these parameters Greeks, written in Greek letters, and distinguish them from the Romans, written in the Roman alphabet. Romans are components of the data generating process that have causal relationships, u, x, and y in our example. Greeks parameterize the Roman distributions. From the perspective of an inference algorithm, they're all random variables. But when it comes to how we use this model to reason causally, this distinction is important. So given unknown theta and data containing observations on u, x, and y, we'll do proper Bayesian inference of y sub x prime. We'll first get the posterior distribution on theta, then we'll sample from the predictive distribution of y sub x prime. We first learn the posterior distribution of theta given x, y, z on the full graph, then generate y from the transformed model as we did before. Again, this is how this algorithm might look in Pyro-like pseudocode. The intuition is that with exact inference, if the data is large enough, we just converge to the original case where thetas were known. Now, what happens if u is latent? Assuming we can train a latent variable model to convergence, will our model transformation with the do operation combined with forward simulation still work? Assuming our training of theta converges, the do operation transformation simulation procedure will still generate samples. But samples of what? If this worked, it would be equivalent to getting the predicted intervention outcome from just the predicted outcome without adjusting for any confounding by the latent u. That feels like a free lunch. In other words, is y sub x prime still identifiable given just x and y? Non-identification here means that the inference algorithm converges to multiple values of the vector theta, and these values would each yield the same joint distribution on x and y, but different intervention distributions on y sub x prime, in the identification through loss function constraints. Parametric identification relies on how the conditional distributions between the Romans are modeled. For example, we might assume a linear model, or that u is a lower dimensional continuous latent representation of a higher dimensional binary x, as one might see in unsupervised learning. Parametric identifiability requires the parametric assumptions to carry a lot of weight. We might do a posterior predictive check to see if the parametric model is a good fit, but we can't falsify a posterior predictive check. We really just have to assume it's the right parametric model. Further, it's challenging to find parametric constraints that provide identifiability while still working on practical problems. Loss function constraints try to address the non-uniqueness of the thetas during training by, for example, using priors or enforcing independence between the parameters. Here, we have a semantic gap. We're trying to use a statistical solution to solve a causal problem. We propose using the do calculus to guarantee identifiability of a causal query in a latent variable model. The do calculus is 3 rules defined in terms of d-separation and transformations on the model structure, specifically removal of causal relationships. We can use the do calculus to determine if a causal query is non-parametrically identifiable given what's observed and what's latent in the data and the structure of a model. The typical use case is as follows. If a causal query is identifiable, construct a Ness demand from the observed variables, a statistical estimator that targets that S demand. Going back to our latent U model, if we add an intermediate variable between X and Y, the model becomes identifiable according to the do calculus. It becomes identifiable through a do calculus derived condition called the front door criterion. The new M variable is called a mediator in the parlance of causal inference. So again, the typical use case for do calculus is to derive a statistical estimator for the S demand. In our example, the front door S demand is this double integral. In constructing an estimator for this S demand, we might observe that we're using these 3 distributions: the probability distribution of M given X, the probability distribution of Y given M and X, and the probability distribution of X. So we can model these 3 distributions directly and separately on X, M, and Y. Finally, we could apply Monte Carlo integration. Alternatively, we could apply other approaches for doing direct estimation of the S demand. This gives us the answer to the causal query. But as probabilistic programmers, We don't want direct estimation. We want to train our latent variable. I say this is indirect because we are training a fully generative model that can handle arbitrary probabilistic queries, including this particular causal query, y sub x prime, as well as other causal queries that are identifiable by the due calculus, for example, m sub x prime. Our key insight is this: so long as our model correctly represents the joint probability of the observed variables, then if we have due calculus identifiability for a given causal query, our train theta, due operation transformation, simulation procedure is just another estimator for that causal query. So how can the causal query be identified when the latents are not? We've only added m to this model, but m's addition doesn't impact our uncertainty about theta or u and its relationship with x and y. The intuition is that this uncertainty is orthogonal to y sub x prime, meaning no matter what answer about u the algorithm converges on, those answers will all say the same thing about y sub x prime. So our takeaway is that we can let the due calculus handle causal identifiability. Discussions about priors, hyperpriors, constrained loss, dimensionality, approximate versus exact inference, we can have these discussions in the context of understanding the properties of our estimator. For example, understanding its variance, its bias, computational complexity, scalability, efficiency, etc. We drive this intuition home with this front door example by showing that simulating from the transformed graph is indeed an estimator for the front door estimand. We show this by taking the probability distribution of y given x prime on the transformed graph and expanding it out until we see that it's equivalent to the front door estimand. Therefore, the procedure of training theta, transforming the model, and simulating y is just an estimator for this estimand.
Great. So I wanted to bring this. This is work that we are working on with Olga Vitek's lab at Northeastern. We've been focusing on some toy examples like this, for example, this Gaussian linear system, where it's really a toy example that shows how if you don't have M here, you don't get identifiability of the parameters, nor of the intervention distribution of interest. But if you include M, then you get that identifiability of the causal query, and you can see that in the analytic form of the multivariate Gaussian, specifically how you have some non-uniqueness of parameters, but you have uniqueness of the function of those parameters that's required to calculate the intervention distribution. We're working on some examples from computational systems biology, namely this IGF, EGF growth factor signaling pathway, where we're interested in the effect of this protein here, SOS, on a downstream protein, ERK, where ERK is a protein associated with proliferation of cells. And these EGF, IGF, and PI3K variables in this model are latent. We train a latent variable model and evaluate our ability to estimate this intervention distribution, where our ground truth is a dynamic from using the Gillespie algorithm. And so we have the ground truth. We can solve this. We can simulate from this model this stochastic differential equation, and we also and we have our latent variable model, and then we vary elements of the inference, such as the number of data that's fed into the latent variable model, the priors, and other factors, and evaluate how well the sampling from the intervention distribution converges to the ground truth distribution. We're doing a similar study with a model of COVID, namely how a inflammation-associated protein affects people who are infected with the disease. Again, this is a simulation model, and we're able to simulate from it and then use our latent variable model to to account for the fact that these bidirected edges here indicate elements of the overall system that we know are that are not present in the or that are not available to our model during training. And again, what we do here is we evaluate our simulated samples from the target causal query against ground truth simulated from the underlying dynamic model. So the obvious question here is like, so this is a closed graph, right? Directed graphical model. How do we extend this to probabilistic programming in general? And I opened this up as a call to action. So we have seen work, particularly by Thomas Eichhardt at Stanford, for how we define D-separation on a probabilistic program. If we get D-separation, we can do some great things. We can falsify our models. For one, we can evaluate, for example, the global Markov condition and see if it aligns with our data. But we can also define the do calculus for a probabilistic program and then be able to validate whether or not a causal query that we submit to our program is identifiable given the data that we trained our model on.
There's one
question
left, Robert.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, say again.
Sorry, you have 1 minute left.
Well, I'm done. So if people have questions.
Oh, wow. Okay, let me come back. Jan Willem is applauding. Okay, so yes, there is a question. Well, first of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is a question from Zena Tavares, our previous speaker. Do you have any thoughts on automating do calculus transformations?
Yeah, I think the first step the first step is that we need people who are very talented at programming languages and semantics to implement some of these abstractions in a probabilistic programming language, make them kind of first-class citizens that we can use in reasoning about our model. Exactly how to do it, I have thoughts, so we could take that offline.
Okay. Are there any other questions? That's the only question I see so far, but we can probably take a minute if anyone else has a question.
Yeah, I just mentioned that. Yep. Go ahead. I was going to say, I'm wondering, and I'll put it out there for the community. When I first started getting into probabilistic programming, this seemed like a glaring issue, like where our models look very causal, and but we never really used them for formal causal inference. And my theory for why it is because we tend to be more interested in modeling how for example, an agent reasons about causality, as opposed to doing causal inferences themselves, like what drug affects what disease, or what economic policy affects some economic outcome, which is much higher stakes. And so given that we are much more flexible working with DAGs and canonical structure, it seems to me that this is an obvious direction to go, but I could be wrong. So I'm curious to get people's feedback.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, while you were talking, a new question came up. Simple one. Do you have any reference paper for your work?
We've just submitted some work to some conferences, but we haven't gotten a approval yet. If you ping me offline, then I can send you a draft.
Okay, I think that what we might do, because there was a similar question for one of our other speakers, is that we might collect all of these links and put them on the website eventually. All right, well, thank you very much. So that's the end of the first session. And just as a reminder, the second session will start in 8 minutes. Then at 1:45 Eastern Daylight Time, we'll have a panel on probabilistic programming in the field, followed by the poster session and networking, followed at 4 p.m. again Eastern Daylight Time by the developer and user meetup. So I will see you all in just a few minutes. Oh.
Just a quick correction. We're starting in 18 minutes from now. the schedule. So we're starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. That's 10:30 a.m. Pacific, and 6:30 p.m. British Standard Time.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.